we need to make sure everyone knows how to actually hook the drill up and what some of the colored lines mean and what they're operating, which will then take us directly into hydraulics. So initial toolbar. So we know that basic toolbars are operating with a cruiser monitor, and at that point we've seen the can style connector, which is the only connection you'll have at the back. At that point you'll have the requirement of hooking these lines up. So the first one here, let's just note that we got in this image, it is a 9400 John Deere. So what we're utilizing here is the first two remotes. So remote number 2 has 1/2 inch red and green tag lines, and those are used to activate the main hydraulic block. They also raise and lower your wings. So the red and green have to be hooked to one remote, and that remote is the one that is always going to be constant. So important to know that that remote is the one that stays constant all the time. So when we talk about hooking those up to the tractor, one of the main things we always want to make sure people know about is, first, you know that red and green go together. Second, that the remote is set to constant, and that when you go to unfold the machine, you move the remote, it starts to unfold the machine. That's what gives you system pressure. And ultimately that's why we need it to be constant, is because we want to maintain a constant system pressure. That system pressure then can be set through flow control. So with most new tractors now, we have the ability to set flow control, and at that point we actually have a system pressure gauge, which is when we get into the block, we want to make sure you know that we want it to operate consistently, which means no fluctuation, between 25 and 2900 psi. And with that, you'll see that with just a straight toolbar, those flows can be very low. And as we go through the block, I'll describe why we can turn that flow as low. Most of it being that we use orifices through our hydraulic block, which I'll show you where they are as well. So with that, we want to know it's set to constant, but then turning the flow control down low enough that it makes sure that our system pressure stays below that 2900 psi. Now, initially, if you guys are concerned, is it going to hurt the machine? It will not hurt the machine. It will not hurt our SeedMaster drill if the system pressure is far too high. What it will hurt is the tractor, which has high pressure standby set to, say, 2950 or something like that, where that's a generic high pressure standby. And you can have the flow control turned all the way to a max and see the system pressure is maybe 3000, 3100 psi. All it's doing is it's forcing more oil than it could ever use, which then it gets a higher pressure, which then it opens up the tractor's high pressure standby. So by no means is it doing us any harm, but it'll take that high flow tractor and turn it into what's you'd almost think is a low flow tractor, because it's putting all the oil it can over the relief, and then at that point it's going from pump to high pressure relief back to tank, which everyone knows that ends up with hydraulic oil heating. So because if it's never returning through the SCV and going back through the tractor cooler, the oil will immediately start to heat. So we don't seem to have as much trouble with the John Deere tractors heating, but it is one thing that is common within New Holland tractors to see them, especially if we get into some of the different models that had maybe smaller oil coolers, but had a high flow ability. So you know, TJs with mega flow or something like that, where if they have the flow set far too high, so say even up to 90-100% max flow of what it is, it's really all it's doing is using up oil and then putting it over high pressure standby relief. So again, for the system pressure and the wing fold options, red and green tag lines, setting the remote to constant, and then from there making sure the flow control is adjusted to maintain a consistent system pressure. So knowing that you can turn with the toolbar those flows down very low. And all you're looking for is consistency. System pressures, you do not want them to fluctuate. So I'll beat that up pretty bad before lunch here as we go. So on remote number 1 on this tractor, which is the lower one here, we have 2 unmarked lines, and one has a ball valve on it, and that is just to be able to lock the pressure into the openers to make sure if we had any leak down on couplers or anything like that, it gives us an ability to lock the pressure within the system. So we actually have a ball valve here and one at the back of the block, which I'll show you shortly. And those 2 lines there, when hooked to that remote, provide you with your shank raise and lower. So it provides you with your fast shank raise and lower on your headlands. So so on this tractor, utilizing remote number 1, first, again, you can adjust the flow control. I typically don't recommend going over 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 on a John Deere, or 70 to 80% on Case New Holland. So at that point, you're flowing through 1/2-inch lines into a fairly low intake hydraulic system, which we do spec out in our sheets as requiring, say on a 70-foot machine, that we'd want 10 gallons a minute on demand, just to give us that quick response. But we don't want that remote set to a full demand, so that's why we want to make sure that that flow is left back in that 3/4 range of 7 or 8 out of 10 or 70 to 80%. And at that point, then we'd want to utilize the timed hydraulic if we'd have. So most of those tractors there, again, will have timed hydraulics. So then from the openers all the way down to when they lift all the way up on that remote number 1, once the flow control is set, then you can set the time. So wanting to make sure that when the openers are all the way up, the remote cuts out or the timer cuts out. So the point being with that is we want to make sure that when we put the openers down, that remote is always coming back to neutral, and when we lift them up, it always comes back to neutral. So the opener raise and lower remote is for on the headlands, to raise them fast for on the headlands, but it's something that we want to make sure that it's only for raising and lowering, that you guys know it is not a constant remote. So that's where it's better to utilize the timed hydraulic. The other one is that when you put the openers down, you're up against gravity and the weight of the opener going down, so it's going to take less time to actually put the opener down. That's the other point of where we can kind of make a note that if you had the ability to set the time for both up and down, then you can certainly utilize that function on this drill for going possibly 7 seconds up and 5 seconds down. So if you don't have that option, you simply set it to what it takes to lift the openers all the way up. So again, I don't set it to a full max because we don't want it to pull off full demand on the tractor. So the last line that you'll see in here is the dump line return. So it is a 1/2-inch open-ended line, and it's open-ended with this open dump line coupler, and that coupler is provided by us to you guys and our customers to make sure that we are returning with full open flow. And the reason that SeedMaster wants that is because this is the return line for the dump line return, and we want it to return directly back unrestricted to tractor tank. And that oil is going to be a continuous at about 5 gallons a minute, but it's also going to be pulsating anything that happens to come off of relief. So any wing relief valves that need to relieve oil, or opener relief valves that need to relieve oil, those are where those oils return. So then it gets a sporadic flow of oil that can come through off of relief, which then is also pulsating. So that's part of why we don't encourage Pioneer couplers in line, and why we want to make sure everyone understands that the dump line is the oil coming off of relief valves, and it has to return, and why we're looking for unrestricted oil flow, because it is coming off of relief. It is where things relieve into, and if it can't relieve it, the machine simply can't relieve oil. So very important that we have that free flowing, and that everyone understands that we're typically aiming for zero pressure. So what our aim and goal is to get as low a pressure as possible, always aiming for 0 psi. There is a scenario to this, an R tractor, 9R. So what it is the tractor is smart enough to know that there's oil going out, but it's not coming back. And what comes up is that we then have to, on the 9Rs, return into what's called power beyond. And we do allow this to happen. So returning into the power beyond port, and then from there, we're also then still requesting it to be set up with a relief valve so that it can be set to a maximum of 70 psi. And at that point, then if it ever hits that 70 psi, it would then relieve back into tank. So then it is returning into the power beyond, but if it spikes up to 70 psi, it will then reroute back into the tractor hydraulic tank. So that is still maintaining charge pressure, which is then maintaining charge pump pressure, which is then your supply oil to your primary and secondary pump. This is the only tractor that I will say will pass your warranty to put a 3/4 inch flat face coupler on, because it becomes a safety concern, and at that point it's pressurized because you're returning into that pressurized power beyond. And with that, if someone unhooked that open-ended coupler off of that tractor and it was running, there's pressure there. So we don't want to be liable to have anyone be burnt or hurt or damaged from hydraulic oil. So at that point, they can operate with a 3/4 inch flat face coupler. So not a Pioneer coupler.